Tonight we're going to talk about the fall of the Soviet Union, which is Objective 23, as well as Objective 24, which is the impact of democracy and the role of the United States as it becomes the sole superpower in the world after the Soviet Union collapses. So here we have the fall of the Berlin Wall, which again was a symbol of the Iron Curtain and the division between the Eastern and Western bloc of the Soviet Union. So the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. Reagan gives a speech in West Berlin asking Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall, and is not much later, that the the Soviet Union falls and Eastern Berliners, climb over the wall and are reunited with their Western families, jobs, etc. after, again, 30 years of separation. So both sides start to tear down the wall themselves. It's the people who do it, not the government. But this division, it's symbolic of this division going away. So, results of Stalin's policies. The bubbles in yellow are the negative effects, and the bubbles in blue are the positive effects. So, perhaps 40 million people died as a result of famine, harsh working conditions, and purges that Stalin put on. Purges are when Stalin would have forms of inquisition, and anyone who seemed to be writing about things he didn't want people writing about, or singing about things he didn't want people singing about or talking about, they were eliminated, essentially. So if these numbers are correct, or supposed numbers are correct, Stalin killed many more people than Hitler. Stalin killed his political opponents and old Bolsheviks who might have posed a challenge to his authority in the party. So many of Lenin's friends were killed by Stalin. Millions died in forced labor camps called gulags. One of Stalin's strategies was to send, these gulags were in Siberia, so political opponents were sent to Siberia the middle of the cold, worked in labor camps, and never made it out. Also, artists, writers, journalists were all sent there as well. Peasants who opposed collectivization or group control and ownership over farms and factories, etc., were branded class enemies, and they were exterminated in the purges. So they were killed. And forced labor was used in the construction of many dams, canals, roads, and other industrial infrastructure. So a lot was built, but it was built through essentially enslaving his own people. Some positive changes. Again, dictators are able to get a lot done. There isn't a lot of bureaucracy in the way. So his plans increased the production of minerals and of fuel. There was industrialization. Heavy machinery plants were built, produced cars, machines. So the production increased greatly. Unemployment was reduced. Because the government was the main employer, everyone was put to work. So a large number of people were also educated because Stalin put in place statewide education and schools. Health conditions also improved because, again, communist states cover health care. And so everyone was immunized and life expectancy increased. So I think it's just important to note that even though he was a tyrannical dictator, these dictators are productive. They can get a lot done. We're going to go through this real quick, but Muammar Gaddafi, for example, of Libya, he was a harsh, horrible dictator, but for the first time in Libya's history, his country had 99 to 100% literacy rate, and people were healthy, etc. Khrushchev. So Khrushchev started off his leadership with a policy of de-Stalinization. And Khrushchev was particularly critical of Stalin's concentration of power, his dictatorship, which people saw as overly harsh. And so Khrushchev divided the power somewhat. Khrushchev was critical of Stalin's elimination of his political opponents and sending them to gulags, as well as his narrow interpretation of Marxism. Khrushchev took on a more liberal interpretation of Marxism. And Khrushchev was very, if not mostly, critical of Stalin's failure to prepare for World War II. He said that Russia did not need to be so injured or in decline because of World War II, and that was Stalin's fault. So what did this look like in practice? Forced labor was stopped, so those gulags, and censorship was eased. Police repression and political trials and executions were eased. There's more focus on goods and increasing living standards, which means we have more privatization of industries, meaning not government owned. Khrushchev, decentralized some of the decision making. He decentralized some of his power. And he eased the Cold War rhetoric. He promoted peaceful coexistence. He visited the U.S. Remember, he met with Kennedy and helped organize the decline of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And during Khrushchev's reign, we have the start of what was called the period of détente, which was a calming down of the Cold War. Khrushchev's changes affected satellite states as well. These would be the states in Eastern Europe. And then we had uprisings. So not everyone was like, oh, yay, wonderful. Instead, people took advantage of this opportunity, like in Poland and in Hungary. And then Khrushchev had to go in with his military and put down those revolutions. So Poland is our first example of protests. In 1956, there were a series of revolts in Poland against communism. And the solution was that the Soviets got involved and said, no, you can't revolt, you must stay with us. But there were some more socialist, so a little less liberal policies put into place. So it's sort of a compromise. And Poland had to promise to continue to support the Warsaw Pact because they didn't want Soviet direct rule. They wanted to be able to be independent, but still under Soviet watch. Hungary was our other example of revolution that we studied. So same year, 1956, we have Hungary declares itself a free nation. We have free elections about to be in place, and then the Soviets invade and restore control. Our leader, Nagy, was seized and executed, 2 years later, and we watched this clip and talked about it with our DBQ between Poland and Hungary. So these uprisings happened, but in the end, these nations continued to be part of the Soviet Union. So the USSR crushes both these rebellions. Soviet tanks roll into Hungary, kill 30,000 Hungarians, and executed the resistance leader. Since Poland wasn't as strongly rebelling or becoming democratic, they didn't have a violent revolution or a violent put down, but they did end up, the revolution was not successful. Instead, it was a compromise. Again, we saw with our DBQ that the U.S. and the UN did nothing to help. Instead, they were more like, we feel for you. But the fact that the Soviet Union had nuclear missiles was a huge deterrent. And because of the Warsaw Pact, if we had invaded Hungary, it would be like we were invading the Soviets, and they would have reacted. So you can see the Stalin statue on the right was smashed in the village square, etc. Then we have Brezhnev, comes after Khrushchev. And as we industrialize in Russia and the economy becomes more complex, it's also difficult to stay so centralized. And so economic growth slowed because as you do this, it becomes less and less efficient for one person to have all the power. So Brezhnev put into place a Politburo, which was the ruling committee of the Communist Party. It enforced laws which limited freedom of speech and of worship. Remember, communism and religion don't get along. And the Politburo used the secret police to arrest dissidents. They were called the KGB. Anyone who criticized the government was arrested and done away with. Brezhnev institutes his own doctrine, which says the Soviet Union has the right to intervene in any other communist nations. So one example, this was after, again, in the wake of Hungary and Poland revolutions. And so the same thing happens in Czechoslovakia. That détente I was talking about, which started with Khrushchev, is a relaxation of the Cold War policy. So we have a little more communication between Brezhnev and Nixon or Johnson, our leaders in America. You have SALT I and SALT II, which are treaties that limit long-range missiles. So this idea was the arms race slowed down. So you should definitely write that down. That part of the détente was the slowing down of the arms race, which was important to both nations because the arms race was an expensive endeavor, and both nations were having a type of recession in the 70s. And so détente becomes an important part of that. Because the arms race burdens the economy of the Soviets and of the US. And so the government has to sacrifice a share of the society's resources, of food, etc. The people aren't being supplied for because the government has to spend so much on developing nuclear missiles and defense systems. So by 1982, stagnation, which means not progress, was obvious as the Soviet Union kept importing grain from the USA secretly. This was very embarrassing. That Russia could not supply for its people and instead had to turn to its enemies for help feeding the people. Okay, so the Czechoslovakia uprising is in 1968, so 12 years after Hungary and Poland. And we have Alexander Dubček, and he introduces reforms into the country. It's socialism. It is not capitalism, but it's socialism, but with a more human face. He wants it to be, about the people and understanding and humanity, etc. It included the freedom of speech and press, this is important, and the freedom to travel abroad. This is called the Prague Spring. This goes against everything that Russia currently has instituted. And it promises a gradual movement towards democracy. But we've seen the pattern. The Soviets invade Czechoslovakia, crush the reforms, kill Dubček, and replace him. And then we have the Gorbachev years. So Gorbachev steps into power. His first goal is to fix the economy. He says that the economy is the reason that communism isn't working and that we're becoming weak. And so to fix the economy, he institutes modernization of technology. So we have industrialization, but it's way behind and outdated. And so he wants to modernize, which means he's going to have to do some research in the West. Okay. So he tries to make a Soviet bureaucracy more efficient, more responsive, so that the economy can progress. He also, because we've seen this is a huge problem with communism, is that workers have no incentive to work hard. They're going to receive their pay in the same amount no matter what. And so Gorbachev institutes incentives for workers to create and produce more. And then there are some major social reforms. The first is glasnost, which means openness, and Gorbachev gives freedom of expression and information, freedom of the press, and right to criticize the government, which everybody does. And so you'd think this makes everybody happy, but instead they start talking about all the problems and how the government isn't serving them, and everyone realizes they're not the only people that feel this way, etc. Then you have perestroika, which is a restructuring. And the idea is to democratize the Soviet political system by having multi-candidate elections, secret ballots where you couldn't be punished for the way you voted, and limited free market capitalism. So more supply, more demand, having consumer goods. It's looking much, much more like the West. But again, this creates people who gain money, who feel powerful, who want to take power for themselves, etc. Gorbachev starts meeting with Reagan and having arms talks. So they agree with the United States to get rid of all their intermediate-range nuclear missiles. And this is a huge thaw in the Cold War tension since the nukes were really at the heart of all the tension and fear. Gorbachev also withdraws his troops from Afghanistan after 9 years of war and occupation in Afghanistan. Okay, so what do these effects have? Worker morale, there's a lack of motivation to produce quality goods. No one's going to get paid more for doing better. Workers were not making enough money to buy the basic goods they needed, and so they were living in poverty. Many workers became alcoholics. Crime rates increased. Society is sort of chaotic. Mortality rate, with death rate, divorce rate, inflation, corruption all increased. The standard of living had declined. Workers were now allowed to criticize the government. Can you imagine what they're saying with all this going on? All these promises made and not being delivered on. So 1990, Gorbachev had to institute rationing because there was not enough food and prices were too high. So people's supplies of bread were limited, sugar were limited, etc. And so there were long lines for simple goods. People started rioting. And again, all this while, Russia is importing grain from the US and Canada. So the economic system and social structure are a total mess at this time in Russia, or the Soviet Union. More on glasnost. Again, it means openness. It allows for, it's a total shift from the communist way. It allows for religious freedom. It allows people to speak against the government. Political prisoners were released from prison. All the books that had been banned, which was many, many books, were now freely printed. And the idea was to combat corruption and the abuse of privilege by political classes. Gorbachev saw the problem was that a lot of the politicians were skinning off the top. They didn't want to live in the horrible conditions that the people were forced to live in. And so there's a lot of corruption. So through reviewing the past or current mistakes, it was hoped that the Soviet people would back reforms such as perestroika, that they would see that the Soviets were moving in the right direction and get on board. And then in 1993, we have the first McDonald's comes to Moscow. And this is a huge deal. Think about and go ahead and brainstorm why. But keep in mind, what country does McDonald's come from? What company? And what is McDonald's kind of a symbol of? Go ahead and write that down in the margins. Okay, more on perestroika. So perestroika means restructuring of the Soviet economy. It's an economic reform, whereas glasnost is a social reform, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, etc. And so it allowed enterprises or companies to set output levels, which means how much it's going to produce, according to demand. So it's not controlled by the government anymore. It permitted private ownership. Remember, in the communist society, it is publicly or government owned in the services, manufacturing, and foreign trade sectors. And this allowed foreign investment, like McDonald's, in the form of joint ventures with Soviet ministries, state enterprises, cooperatives. Other countries could come in and essentially make money. This means that Soviet business people could work with other countries, learn how much money other countries were making, or CEOs, etc., in other countries, and want that for themselves. So it allowed some private property, some small businesses to get profits, some free trade, some authority or limited authority over farms and factories. Okay, so the cost of the war and global pressure. Again, Russia was spending lots and lots of money on arms, and it was challenging their ability to feed their people. Wars were costly, like Afghanistan and Korea, etc. There was total employment. Everyone was being employed, and there weren't enough goods to feed the people. The national health care that was offered by the Soviets was not very good health care. And then you have people like the Pope coming in and encouraging the Soviets to open up. And so as a Catholic or somewhat Catholic country, people oppose this, right? They're largely Orthodox or not religious at all. But when you have the Pope, who's a symbol of peace and internationalism, saying this is not okay, etc. Ronald Reagan calls the Soviets the evil empire and institutes a Star Wars plan. The Star Wars plan was that the U.S. was going to stop building their military offense and nukes. Instead, they were going to focus on military defense. So missiles that would shoot down missiles coming to the country. The idea was that now the Soviets are the bad guys. We're not trying to attack them. We just need to defend ourselves. So the quote from Gorbachev: "What has happened in Eastern Europe in recent years would not have been possible without the presence of this Pope, without the great role, even political, that he has played in the world scene." So Gorbachev and the Pope met, and he said, you know, this atheist ideology where the morality of your country, etc. Okay, so now to the fall of the Soviet Union. Here we go. So glasnost and perestroika, these new economic and social reforms, give a lot of freedoms to the people, but they don't make the conditions better. And so the people have a lot to complain about. They don't really think that the new government is all it's cracked up to be. And so this rapid change led to food shortages, to unemployment, so all these economic changes, inflation. So as Eastern European nations began to gain freedom from communism in the Soviet Union, they pushed for independence, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And so we have almost an opposite domino theory where the fall of communism leads to spreading of the fall of communism. So hardline communists spoke out against the reforms. They said this is not what communism is about. They tried to take Gorbachev out of power. So the coup failed, but it weakened Gorbachev. Then you have Boris Yeltsin, and he becomes to rise to power, and he called for more reforms. He said that Russia was independent of the Soviet Union, and he declared himself the first president of Russia. So if you wait a minute and think about how Russia was the head of the Soviet Union and the basis for the Soviet Union, if Russia then withdraws from the Soviet Union, what power is it going to have? So we end up with the Soviet Union collapsing. There's a new Commonwealth of Independent States, which was formed, and it was made up of independent nations that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. So we have 17 new nations that are formed out of the fall of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had to resign because now he's the leader of a country, the Soviet Union, that no longer exists because Russia's backed out of it. So after 74 years, the Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War is over. So I write in the margins how Gorbachev's policies that really had the best of intentions led to the downfall of his own leadership in the Soviet Union. Okay, so now we have Ronald Reagan, and this video is his speech where he asked Gorbachev to tear down this wall. And due to a growing sense of nationalism and desire for more political rights, Eastern European nations pushed for reforms. They pushed for a opening up of the Eastern Bloc and a fall of the Iron Curtain. The Russian communist grip loosens due to poor economy and global pressure. Essentially, communism isn't really working for the people, and so it becomes weakened. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika allow for some political and economic freedoms, but they don't fix the economy, and that is the biggest problem for the people at this point. So there's an attempted coup. Some of the high-level officials, the communist hardliners, wanted Gorbachev out. They said he's, bastardizing communism. Gorbachev refused, Pardon me? But the group staged a coup anyway and put Gorbachev under house arrest, and they put tanks into Moscow to seize control. So while Gorbachev is under house arrest, Boris Yeltsin calls for the people to resist the coup, and he gains the support of the military. So the coup is foiled. The Soviet Union splits into 15 different republics, the CIS, plus the Soviet Union. So Eastern Europe becomes free, which is encouraged by Gorbachev. You see the image on the right of all our Eastern Europeans climbing over the Berlin Wall, which was so heavily fortified for so long. On the left, we have our Polish leader who's elected freely. In Hungary, you have allowed free elections. They renounce the Communist Party. They become democratic. East Germany, the East German Communist Politburo resigns. Travel restrictions are lifted. Germany is reunited and becomes a democratic state. So, more on the freedom. Czechoslovakia, the Politburo resigned. We're going to see this pattern. And free elections do not choose communist as the leader. We have what's called the Velvet Revolution, which is a peaceful democratic takeover by Havel, who becomes the president of Czechoslovakia. And then Czechoslovakia splits into Czech Republic and Slovakia, which is how we get 17 new nations. Because there's 15 CIS or CIS, Commonwealth of Independent State Nations, plus the split of Czechoslovakia into Czech Republic and Slovakia and Russia. Bulgaria has free elections and the Communist Party is not selected. Romania has a violent revolution. And protests gained support for the army and secret police who sided with the people. And our totalitarian leader is executed on Christmas Day. So think about how Gorbachev's reforms affected Eastern European nations, and go ahead and reflect on that in the margins. And here's a simple timeline for you. You can see all the proxy wars and the life of the Soviet Union, the order of the Soviet leaders, and the presidents that are in power at that same time. Here we have the same kind of timeline, but more of a map line, global perspective of the Cold War. Then we have Russia, and the point here is that Russia is a very diverse place. It has numerous ethnic groups, languages, customs, and only half of the 285 million people were actually Russian in heritage. So it's difficult to unite a single nation without fear of force that's so diverse, right? Nationalism was stronger than communism. People wanted to rule themselves. They wanted to, represent the rights of their ethnic group. Here we have Gorbachev is the sad USSR leaving the sandbox, and Russia, that's Boris Yeltsin in the sandbox, and he is now the leader, and he has claimed control and has pushed Gorbachev out by saying that Russia has left the Soviet Union. The sinking ship of the Soviet Union and all our new states that will become part of the Commonwealth of Independent States. You have Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, Turkey, Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Estonia, Latvia, etc. Okay, Czech Republic, Slovakia. And here again, we have kind of the division and the new nations that pop up around the Soviet Union. Our new nations, independent states. And here is where Russia has a difficult transition going from communist to not so communist. We have the young girl. See, Grandma, capitalism has given us so many choices. Look at my new Italian shoes. She's imported some shoes. She's voting for Yeltsin. You can see on her button. But the grandma says, yes, yes, but at least under Brezhnev, we didn't have to eat our shoes because you can import goods, etc. But if the people aren't eating, the people aren't eating, right? There's not enough food.